Welcome, foolish mortals, back to the Villain's Lair. I'm so excited to talk to you today, and I'm really grateful that you tuned in. Today was kind of a struggle for me. If you may have noticed, this is kind of my first Villain's Lair in a little while. My original plan was to cover Stromboli from Pinocchio, but it's really just not a lot to work with him. I find the more I watch Pinocchio, the more I find out that the actual antagonists are kind of weak, really. There's pretty much just, I'm greedy, and here's this freak that I can make a freak show out of, and really the primary antagonist of Pinocchio is Pinocchio, if you think about it. He really just makes a lot of really bad, stupid decisions, and that really is the root of all the trouble that he runs into. And you could make a case that Honest John and Gideon are kind of the issue, too, but for the most part, Pinocchio is his own worst enemy. And so it's hard to nail down a specific villain for that movie because he's also the hero of the movie. And so, I just didn't want to go there. There wasn't enough for me to make a whole video out of. So instead I'm going to switch to the next week's villain, and that is Evelyn Dever, aka Screenslaver from The Incredibles 2. This was a fantastic deep dive. It's always great to have a villain that I kind of relate to on a better level, just because I find their motivation much more human. It's hard to relate to villains that do what they do for the sake of evil. It's not an intriguing character. Evelyn Dever is a very intriguing character. Her motivations overall are pretty easy to relate to. First things first, this girl is a genius. She is effectively the mind behind DevTech, her family's company. Her brother is kind of the public face of the company. With his charisma and his people skills, he just works well in that arena. He's great at drawing people to their product, to their, company, and it's great. Evelyn prefers not to deal with people. She prefers to deal with machines, and she's really, really good at it. That's not to say that she's entirely socially awkward. She's just not motivated by people. She doesn't seem to get really attached. And I think the loss of their parents may have a lot to do with that. You can only lose so many people before you hesitate to get attached to more of them. I'm sinking into the couch. I'm just getting shorter by the minute. So, we right away get a big chunk of Evelyn and Winston's backstory as soon as we meet them in Incredibles 2. Winston especially tells the story of how their parents were killed during a burglary when their father tried to call out to heroes, but because of the Hero Relocation Act, those heroes knew that it was illegal to respond and take action to save this man that had effectively been their friend and supporter throughout their entire business relationship. This is where we get the first kind of glimpse of Evelyn's true character as well. She kind of gets a little irritated about her father not taking their mother to the panic room and hiding in there. Yes, you'd lose some of your possessions, but you'd be safe. And so you can see right away this irritation she has with being dependent on someone else. And this is really the biggest foreshadowing moment we get. Because other than that, Evelyn is really chill, really relaxed, really personable, for pretty much the rest of the movie up until the big reveal. And I think this is kind of her biggest moment where you see her kind of show her hand a little bit, because while she's very, very calm for the rest of the film, this is the first moment where we see her get pretty fired up. And while it's just for a second, and while it's a topic that anybody would be upset about, so we don't think much of it, this is that first look into her psyche, where rather than blaming the Hero Relocation Act for the death of her parents, she directly blames her father and the supers as a whole. But she mostly blames her father. It seems like kind of an interesting place to direct the blame. I find it interesting, too, that neither of the Dever kids blame the actual robbers who shot her father. Winston blames the Hero Relocation Act for making it so the heroes couldn't actively come in and save their parents, and Evelyn blames her father for his weakness and his dependence on other people, neither of them blame the actual person who pulled the trigger. It's kind of weird. I always find displaced blame really strange. It's like blaming an inanimate object for an action that a person performed while using the inanimate object. It doesn't make sense, but humans are emotional and we misplace blame all the time. Now, what I'm going to say next is a little controversial, so I want you to bear with me. All over YouTube and all over the internet when, Avengers Infinity War came out, there were all these YouTubers who went ahead and said that Thanos was right. And Thanos wanted genocide, so if you can go ahead and say that right, and those people's channels are still up, I think I can be pretty confident in saying that while genocide is always wrong and Thanos was wrong, Evelyn Dever, for the most part, was right. And, it was how she went about proving she was right that was the problem, but overall, her general mentality is correct in this movie. It was very difficult, because I actually really agree with her for the most part, and that kind of bothers me. I kind of hate when I relate to the villain a little better than the heroes, and it happens more often than I would like, but, more so with the newer round of Disney villains than with the older ones, like Maleficent, who, was pretty much evil for evil's sake. I've never been so mad about not being invited to a party that I wanted to kill a child, so I can't relate to that level of villainy. However, Evelyn's level of villainy is a little more human, and I relate to it a little better. Her premise is that if you are somebody who is completely dependent on someone else to take care of you, you will never learn to or be motivated to take care of yourself. And by society depending completely on supers, they've made themselves incredibly lazy and vulnerable. And I actually agree with her. I think people will never work for something that they can be given for free. And if you never work, you never get stronger. Whether it's working out or working your brain. If you never read, you'll never get smarter, that kind of thing. If you don't have to puzzle your way through things, you won't gain intelligence. If you don't move your muscles, they won't grow. And so her concern is that people's dependence on the supers is making them weak because they are not exercising, situational awareness techniques or even just going out and experiencing life. Her other point that she largely argues too is that people have become effectively slaves to their machines, and therefore the name Screenslaver. Now, The Incredibles takes place, I believe, in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, quite some time ago, right? So the screens effective in their lives at the time were, for the most part, television screens. However, I think Evelyn's convictions would not be eased at all if she saw how dependent people are on their cell phone screens these days. So this is another matter where I find myself agreeing with the villain, and it's getting uncomfortable in here, guys, because I don't like agreeing with the villain. But I think she's right on that account too. Not only have we allowed ourselves to be weaker by depending on others to take care of us, but we do also kind of live through our phones and through our TVs and through movies and iPads and tablets, and we never look up anymore. How many times have you been in a restaurant and you see a little kid just wandering around the restaurant because mom and dad are both on their phones not looking? It's terrifying how dependent people have gotten on screens, and it's terrifying how dependent people have gotten on free junk. And so, really, she's right on both accounts. Completely right. Self-reliance gives you strength, and depending on others for your needs and for your defense comes at the cost of your own freedom and security, because you are effectively at the mercy of that person. That person can choose not to defend you. I mean, yes, we see Mrs. Incredible willing to try and break the law in order to bring superheroes back into popularity, but you can't forget that Phyronic and Gazerbeam were not willing to break the law to save the Devers, upon whom they relied heavily for their support. And so they should have had a very personal investment in saving Mr. Dever, and yet they did not. They were not willing to break the law for that. They weren't even willing to call the police. And so, I mean, they didn't even pick up the phone. And so it's it's very dangerous to depend on others for everything, because no one will be invested in your safety, in your future, in your responsibilities more than you are. And in that sense, Evelyn is correct. She sees the inevitable loss of security that comes from putting your security in somebody else's hands, when that person will inevitably prioritize themselves and their well-being over you. And, that's just human instinct. You can't blame that person for that. But by giving them the responsibility to look after you, you've put yourself in a dangerous position, but you've also given up your freedom, because now you depend on them to do these things for you at the cost of being able to do them yourself. You have to follow their commands if you want to continue to retain their services and their protection. And so, it effectively makes you a servant in the same way that the screens do. You just give up your life. And it's terrible. It's really terrible. But she's right. And I hate agreeing with the villain. But really where I disagree with Evelyn is her means of carrying out her point. She makes an excellent point that relying on supers to protect you only inevitably puts you in more danger, but she makes this point by putting people in danger, by endangering people's lives and by stealing their freedom, because you forget the supers are humans also, and she literally takes away their will, which is really terrifying. But she tries to make a point about strength and freedom by taking away people's strength and freedom, and ultimately taking several lives, and that is ridiculous, because she's become so obsessed with vengeance, so obsessed with her bitterness and rage, that she doesn't even see that she's undermining her own point. And that ultimately is where she and I would have to kind of part ways, because I am all about being independent. I love independence. I love freedom. I love having the personal strength to take care of myself, but not at the cost of another person's life or another person's will. And she takes it too far, ultimately. Now, I do want to read to you the monologue that she gives while Elastigirl is riding through town on her Elasticycle, and she's doing all of these crazy acrobatics, and the music is intense, and the cutting of the camera is intense, and Screenslaver is talking through this voice synthesizer thing, so you don't really get a good beat on what exactly it is that she's saying. And what she's saying is very important, but everything's so intense and happening so quickly, and you're so focused on Elastigirl that often most people miss the complete monologue. They just catch snatches of it. So I did go ahead and save it here. Let's take a look. She says, Screenslaver interrupts this program for an important announcement. Don't bother watching the rest. Elastigirl doesn't save the day. She only postpones her defeat. And while she postpones her defeat, you eat chips and watch her invert the problems that you're too lazy to deal with. Superheroes are part of a brainless desire to replace true desire with simulation. You don't talk, you watch talk shows. You don't play games, you watch game shows. Travel, relationships, risk, every meaningful experience must be packaged and delivered to you to watch at a distance so that you can remain ever sheltered, ever passive, ever ravenous consumers who can't free themselves to rise from their couches to break a sweat and never anticipating a new life. You want superheroes to protect you and make yourselves even more powerless in the process, while you tell yourself that you're being looked after, that you're inches away from being served, and your rights are being upheld. So the system can keep on stealing from you and smiling all the while. Go ahead and send your supers to stop me. Grab your snacks, watch your screens, and see what happens. You're no longer in control. I am. And that's where it gets a little terrifying. She takes, what would be a great message about human life and human rights and going out and enjoying nature and being active and experiencing your life, and she takes that to an extreme where she wants to strip away other humans' rights. And I think in many ways she sees the supers as no longer human because they have these powers, because she doesn't attribute the rights that she's trying to stand for as something that they also should have. So I think she does. She very much undermines her own point. And her points are good points. It's just that she presents them the wrong way. I don't know how to put it exactly, but, you know, her answers are deceit and stealing people's will, and eventually, I'm sure at least a couple people died in this process. And so that ultimately takes what would have been a good point and turns it on its head and makes her the villain, when she could be just kind of a civil rights person, you know? So she's really the one who makes herself into this villain. And unlike a lot of the villains I've talked about, I really don't think that there's like a mental illness there that she can push her struggles onto. I genuinely think these are just awful choices. She chooses to be obsessed with her past. She chooses rage and bitterness over forgiveness and peace. And she chooses to do violence to other people in order to further her point. Please excuse me. I'm still just a little raspy after the flu last week. I apologize. But ultimately, she chooses the way in which she behaves, and so I think that she has ruined her own life and the lives of others, and there's really no excuse for it, especially when this is not a compulsion that she serves. This is her own terrible, wicked desire and her own choice. We should seek to experience life and gain independence, but this only works when we are not ruled by rage and bitterness. Be strong, be free, but don't be crazy. If you liked the show and you liked the opportunity to break down a classic Disney villain, and especially a very relatable one, thank you so much for tuning in. Go ahead and like and subscribe to my channel, and pay attention to Facebook, YouTube, and patreon.com/shiveringmouse in order to be alerted when more videos are posted. I do try to post about 3 times a week at least, so stay tuned. There will always be more. And I want to send up a quick thanks to everyone who has been liking and subscribing my podcast episodes on SoundCloud and other podcast platforms. I'm so grateful. I know it's been a while since I've been able to update, so it really does reassure me to know that you guys are still out there, still tuning in, still listening to the podcast and waiting for the next episode. I really appreciate it. That's all for today, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I'm so glad you took time to listen to me.